Welcome to episode 117 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm delighted to talk about Pharoah Sanders' 1971 album on Impulse, Thembi. And I'm fortunate to have a first pressing of this, not just because of the funky gatefold cover, but also because I find that if you're looking for those classic Impulse releases of the late 60s and early 70s, it really is worth paying an extra few bucks to get hold of the earlier pressings rather than anything pressed after, say, 1973. This is Pharoah Sanders at the height of his so-called spiritual jazz or astral jazz period. And what you get on this album, as you get with a lot of albums in his Impulse years, is a mixture of pastoral, uplifting, sometimes almost jubilant music combined with heavy elements of free jazz. Like Sanders himself, this whole album is fundamentally inventive. It features a whole range of sounds, instruments, and moods. Sanders was born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1940, and he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was musical from an early age, but he felt stifled by the oppression faced by black people in what was basically a quasi-apartheid society in that region. And right after high school, he moved to Oakland. And Oakland is where he began his professional career as a saxophonist, playing mostly R&B in local bands, but slowly moving into jazz. He was getting gigs, but the options for him in Oakland were still pretty limited, so in 1961 he moved to New York City, and he lived for a couple of years basically couch surfing at various musicians' houses. At this point, he was still playing under his birth name of Pharoah Sanders, and one of the folks that took him in was the space-age jazz guru Sun Ra. And Sun Ra, unsurprisingly, suggested that he needed to leave his earthly name behind and pick something a little more evocative of the kind of music that he was already starting to play, and so he suggested that he take the name Pharoah. By 1965, he was in John Coltrane's band for the very last stage of Coltrane's career, the avant-garde phase. And at this point, Sanders had developed into being a leading exponent of free jazz. He had a very dissonant style, and he'd come to use what's known as overblowing, essentially blowing so hard that you distort the sound of the saxophone to convey emotion. This was heavily influential on Coltrane, and in turn, Coltrane's work was heavily influential on Sanders in terms of the spiritual exploration and journey which Coltrane had been on since 1957. Sanders' first recordings are a little bit tentative and traditional, largely due to the musicians which his label picked to play with him. But after 1966, all of this changes. Bob Thiele signs him to Impulse Records, which of course was Coltrane's label. And for Impulse, Sanders puts out a string of albums which I would say are amongst the most remarkable jazz albums ever made. Those include his debut on Impulse, Tawheed, Karma, Jewels of Thought, and this one, Thembi. All in all, between 1967 and 1974, Sanders puts out 11 incredible albums on Impulse, as well as 2 spectacular collaborations with Alice Coltrane, John Coltrane's widow. His relative lack of fame is not too surprising because some of his work, as indeed on this album itself, can be a little bit inaccessible or sometimes very inaccessible. But some of his other pieces are arguably more beautiful and more appealing to the listener than anything Davis or Coltrane managed to record in their careers. On this journey, Sanders has several significant collaborators, and 3 are certainly worthy of mention. The first of those, who does not appear in this album, is a guy called Leon Thomas. Thomas, of course, is a singer who invented jazz yodeling and turned it into an art form. Sanders' 2 other frequent collaborators are both on this record, Cecil McBee, the bass player, and Lonnie Liston Smith on keyboards. Thembi is the 3rd consecutive Sanders album in which they both appear, after Blind Deaf Dumb, or Summum Bukmum Omyun, and Jewels of Thought. While there's a good case that this is Pharoah Sanders' greatest album, it's also quite possibly the ending of an era, because within a year or two, Sanders came to the conclusion that spiritual jazz and free jazz was just not selling records, and he needed to make a change. So he left Impulse in 1973, 2 years after this came out, and started to return to a more R&B influenced sound, which of course goes back to his very origins as a musician. This album is a product of 2 recording sessions, one at the Record Plant LA, that's side 1, and then side 2 at the Record Plant in New York. And for each of those sessions, there's a different lineup. It's produced by Ed Michel and Bill Simchek, who is also the engineer. And like so many other Impulse albums, this album sounds so great to the ear, it's just like butter. Both sides of the album have the core trio of Pharoah Sanders on alto sax, tenor sax, and percussion. He actually plays a ton of different percussion instruments here. Lonnie Liston Smith on keyboards, both acoustic piano but also the Fender Rhodes Electric, and Cecil McBee on bass, which he both plucks with his fingers but also plays with a bow. In Los Angeles, you also have Michael White on violin, Clifford Jarvis on drums, and James Jordan on percussion. In the New York sessions for side 2, the core trio remain, but White, Jarvis, and Jordan are gone, and replacing them are Roy Haynes on drums, and then 4 other percussionists, Chief Bey, Majid Shabazz, Anthony Wiles, and Nat Bettis, and those 4 percussionists make a huge difference to the sound of side 2. This album's a real evolution for Sanders because in his previous albums he had really been unedited. He had recorded tracks which were sometimes the whole side or even more than a whole side of a record. So for instance, The Creator Has a Master Plan and Karma is well in excess of half an hour. By contrast, this album has 7 songs. There's nothing longer than 9 minutes. One interesting aspect of this album is that for Lonnie Liston Smith, the keyboardist, this is the very first time he ever plays a Fender Rhodes electric piano. He'd only ever played acoustic piano throughout his career prior to stepping into the studio in Los Angeles. And when they get into the studio, he sees the piano over there and he starts tinkling away and playing around. And Sanders and McBee come up to him and say, "What are you playing?" And he goes, "I'm just messing about." And they say, no, that's going to be the first track on our album. And sure enough, it became the song Astral Traveling. In addition to being part of the story of this album, this is historically significant because the Fender Rhodes, along with the clavinet, probably the 2 instruments which were most influential, the most signature sounds of jazz funk throughout the mid-1970s. And of course, Lonnie Liston Smith was one of the leading exponents. So this is really like, in some respects, hearing Miles Davis pick up a trumpet for the first time. It really is a foundational piece for a sound which was to develop over the coming decade. And side 1 does start with that Lonnie Liston Smith composition, Astral Traveling. The whole feeling of this song is pastoral. There are some cool bird sounds. Cecil McBee's bass comes in very gently, but it's a really central feature all the way through this song. When Pharoah comes in his alto sax, he's playing very gentle bird-like solo lines, kind of matching the mood that was already set with the bass. There is a little bit of overblowing, but it's very controlled. And I mentioned Smith starting his love affair with the Fender Rhodes in this track. He has at the very beginning this subtle chordal accompaniment with his piano sounding a little bit processed. Eventually, when he does solo, he's sharing the space with McBee's bass. I love this so much. If there's a word to describe this song, I think that word is lush. On the next track, Red, Black, and Green, you have a 180-degree switch. You have a dense cacophony of free jazz. Sanders is multi-tracked here. In fact, they probably used almost every track available to them in the recording studio. And I think you have to say, this is some noisy shit, but at the same time, while it's chaotic, it's not jarring. The sound is very rich and full, and soon enough it mellows, and out of the noise, Sanders' sax begins to leap and take flight. And after all that, we segue into a much more peaceful space with the title track, Thembi. And this is just a beautiful song. In this track, we're back to the joyful, uplifting, jubilant version of Sanders. Side 2 starts with a song called Love, which is a solo piece on bass by Cecil McBee, and this is my candidate for the greatest bass solo in the history of the 20th century. McBee offers almost everything you can get from the bass on this track, all by himself. Delicate notes high up in the neck, a superb vibrato, these sliding notes. It's so incredibly well recorded that you can hear pretty much every touch of his fingers on the strings. You can practically hear him breathing. This is an album highlight and it's a career highlight for McBee. The range of textures that he gets just for those 4 strings is amazing. Love segues into Morning Prayer, which is another song which has a writing credit for Lonnie Liston Smith. Here, the payoff of having a drummer plus 4 percussionists is really evident. This is one of the great moments on the album. You've got this wonderful percussive rhythm, then you have Lonnie Liston Smith soloing over top. Eventually he joins in the rhythm and this song really swings. This is a total showpiece for the keyboardist. The final song is a composition by Sanders, which is Balafone Dance. Now, balafone is kind of African xylophone. This is all about having those 5 different percussion players. It's totally multi-layered. It's a delicious track, and with this, a diverse and amazing album has come to a close. Free jazz is a rarefied and acquired taste, and Sanders himself, within a couple of years of this album, would start to move towards sounds which were much more commercially accessible. But the free jazz elements of this album are actually in the minority here. For the most part, what you get are beautiful, pastoral, uplifting passages which celebrate different cultures and celebrate different instruments and celebrate different sounds. The book on this album, according to some people, is that it's all over the map. I would have to disagree with that. I think there is a ton of variety. There's very little which is predictable from one song to another, and yet it's undeniable, I think, when you listen to it, that it comes together as a cohesive whole. It's maybe the most accessible album of all of Sanders' Impulse years, and arguably, it's the greatest ever work by one of the most innovative and risk-taking artists in the history of jazz. It's an essential listen, and it's easily 5 out of 5.